Good morning, everyone. Good morning, everyone in the nave and everyone on Zoom. Welcome to today's forum, Finding Our Roots, St. Columba's Church, Tenleytown, and Race, 1874 to 1930. This forum is brought to you by Stirring the Waters, a ministry of racial justice at St. Columba's. And to learn more about Stirring the Waters, you can visit our webpage and also our Facebook page. After the forum, you will receive a survey for your response and feedback on the session, and the session will be available on YouTube. A note on technology: please use the chat feature in the Zoom as you always have been, and Joshua and Linda will be collecting questions in the nave to put in the chat. You will all be muted during the presentation, which is approximately 30 minutes, after which we will open up for questions. Today, we will learn about our parish roots in a presentation by Sandra Mills. Sandra has been a parishioner at St. Columba's for 25 years. A lawyer by profession, she has studied history through academic coursework, and most recently, Sandra has dedicated herself to exploring St. Columba's history within the context of the history of Tenleytown and the Reno neighborhoods, the Diocese of Washington, Washington, D.C., and the country. We are very fortunate to have her share some of what she has learned with us today. Over to you, Sandra.
Thank you very much, Lauren, and thank you, Joshua. In the fall of 2019, I went on a walking tour of Tenleytown led by a local historian named Neil Flanagan. The tour took us up to Fort Reno Park, that large piece of land just up the hill on the other side of Wisconsin Avenue from here. That was the first time I heard about the community formerly known as Reno City that once occupied that land. Some of you know this story, but for those of you who don't, here's a short summary. Reno City developed after the Union Army left its fort at the end of the Civil War. Formerly enslaved African Americans and some whites built homes and churches and thrived there for over 60 years. But the community was destroyed beginning in the late 1920s to make way for the Alice Steele Junior High, only for white students, and to create a so-called high-class, all-white neighborhood on the surrounding land. The racist motives for driving out the African Americans from Reno were hardly a secret. So here's a map of St. Albans Parish. This was as of 1911. But you can see St. Albans down to the sort of in the middle of the map. And then if you follow up to the north of that, you can see where St. Columba's Parish is and where St. George's Parish used to be, just the other side of what is today's Wisconsin Avenue. This discovery raised many questions for me. What led St. Albans to establish St. Columba's and St. George's as missions in the first place? Why was a separate mission established at Fort Reno, given its proximity to St. Columba's? How did St. Columba's come to be responsible for the mission at Fort Reno? And what was the relationship between St. Columba's, St. George's, and the Reno community like? How did St. Columba's respond to the destruction of the Reno community and its mission church there? And finally, what became of St. George's after it closed? Well, I started digging around in church and diocesan records and a lot of public sources. And what I found is that this is really a tale of two churches. Both were children of St. Albans, and both were born out of the enormous change in Tenleytown wrought by the Civil War. And yet we see that their stories turned out very differently. So let's first start with the establishment of St. Columba's. In 1874, St. Albans Parish founded its mission in Tenleytown. Land along what was then Murdoch Mill Road was donated by a member of St. Albans Vestry, WDC, or William Murdoch. St. Albans built a chapel there in 1875, which we can see in this photo. It was simply a wood frame chapel that became known as St. Columba's, We can see the Columba Oak off to the left. By the time this photo was taken, a parish hall had been added on in 1911, which you can see just behind the Columba oak tree. Well, St. Albans Parish itself was only founded in 1854, so it was barely 20 years old at the time. Why did St. Albans establish a mission in Tenleytown? Well, it would be hard to overestimate the impact of the Civil War on what was then called Tennallytown. That was named after a man who owned an inn. That was his last name. Before the war, today's Wisconsin Avenue was just a trade route. It was a former Native American footpath servicing the surrounding plantations as plantation owners rolled their tobacco down to the port of Georgetown. You could get a pint and a room for the night at John Tennelly's Inn at the top of the hill, just a block or so from St. Columba's Church. The Union forts at Reno and Bayard near today's Wisconsin Avenue brought soldiers and laborers for the war effort, a lot of them. Many African Americans sought refuge at the Union forts and helped the Union Army during the war, and many stayed, having really nowhere else to go after the war. In the 1870 census, the population of Tenleytown was about 1/3 African American. And that probably undercounted the African Americans who were still camping out on the Fort Reno land. This became by far the fastest growing area of St. Albans Parish, which, as you could see from the map, was very large. After the war, Tenleytown was frankly pretty rowdy. Drunkenness and brawling were commonplace. So St. Albans evidently recognized the need for missionary work in the area. Travel down the rut-filled, unpaved Tenleytown Road was very difficult. Folks weren't coming to church at St. Albans, so the church came to them. Well, who were the founders of the Tenleytown Mission? Many were members of the old landed gentry who had originally settled the area west of Rock Creek and then founded St. Albans in 1854. And many of them owned or had owned enslaved persons. Their lives were turned upside down by the war. The Union Army did not trust the loyalties of these landowners. They raided their homes looking for hiding Confederate soldiers. They took their livestock, their timber, and their crops for the war effort. To give you some sense of these individuals, let's consider vestry member W.D.C. Murdoch, who donated the land where St. Columba's began. He was descended from a long line of English Anglicans who came to own what was known as the Friendship Tract. We've heard of Friendship Heights. This was several thousand acres running to the west of today's Wisconsin Avenue. Part of this land later became St. Columba's Parish. Murdoch grew up in the Manor House, located on the land where American University's President's House now is. He inherited the plantation and many enslaved persons. He was living there as a gentleman farmer and held these enslaved persons when the war broke out. We don't have a photograph of Murdoch, but we do have the petition that he filled out in his own hand, seeking compensation for 9 persons who were freed in 1862 by the Compensated Emancipation Act of the District of Columbia. Congress freed enslaved persons in DC, but allowed the owners to claim compensation for their supposed property losses. No compensation was provided to those who had been enslaved. And I'm sorry, this is not a great image. You can see all of these petitions actually online. But the highlighted area here describes 2 brothers, William H. Lee and F. H. Lee, who were 20 years old. Murdoch described them in great detail. He even had them officially appraised. And he asked for compensation of $2,300 for the 2 men. The Lee brothers evidently maintained ties with Murdoch after the war. According to his obituary, these two served as his pallbearers when he died in 1886. Well, after the war, Murdoch fell on hard times. He was forced to start selling off his properties. He was engaged in legal disputes with the United States over the Army's taking of the timber off of his land. His estate later won a large judgment from the United States government, and this enabled his daughter, Mary Ann, to leave a large bequest to St. Columba's when she died in 1920. I found it sobering then to realize that St. Columba's was actually made possible because we received land and wealth accumulated by generations of the Murdoch family who had relied on the labor of enslaved persons. Well, and so it was into this post-Civil War time and place that the mission that became St. Columba's was born. It grew in fits and starts during the next 25 years. It was impeded by a lack of stable clergy. Tenleytown remained a rural outpost that attracted now some new European immigrants, Germans, Irish, and Italians. These post-Civil War arrivals were nowhere near as prosperous as those first settlers had been hundreds of years earlier. Most Tenleytowners were lower middle class or working class. Most would have been just simply working people. Some would have even been classified as poor, and very few would have been called well off. The African American population settled in at Reno City. The census for the area continued to show that about 1/3 of the population remained African American. 3 events spurred the growth of the Tennallytown Mission. First, in 1890, the first electric streetcars on today's Wisconsin Avenue brought many more people to the area. It became more accessible and attractive, so the population grew. Second, the Episcopal Diocese of Washington separated from the Diocese of Maryland. This was important because the new bishop, Satterlee, sought to invigorate the new diocese and promoted the mission activities of St. Albans. Satterlee brought Reverend Bratnall as the new rector of St. Albans, and he and his wife Louisa lavished attention on the mission. In 1900, a parish hall was added to the chapel. In 1904, the mission was finally given its name of St. Columba's, and an auxiliary vestry was formed to give St. Columba's more autonomy and control over its affairs. And a full-time vicar was finally assigned to St. Columba's. These efforts paid off. By 1911, St. Columba's had a new chapel building and an expanded parish hall. You can see this in the slide. The construction was financed largely by St. Columba's growing congregation. Reverend William Shearer became the vicar, and he stayed for 15 years, finally bringing stability to the church. The bishop consecrated this chapel in 1916. Well, turning now to St. George's. So what about all of the African Americans who came to Tenleytown after the Civil War? Given the prevailing culture of segregation, including within the Episcopal Church, St. Columba's congregation was probably virtually entirely white. Well, Bishop Satterlee and Reverend Bratnall wanted to reach out to the African Americans. Satterlee was a New Yorker with little patience for the growing Jim Crow culture of the South. He was one of the most prominent church leaders of his time, praised even by President Theodore Roosevelt as a pragmatic leader. With Satterlee's support, in 1899, St. Albans founded another mission in Tenleytown, this one for the African Americans living in the thriving Reno community. Here's a photo of the row house. Yes, we'll go back to that slide. This is a photo of the row house in Reno City, where services were initially held by St. Albans clergy and a deacon. And in 1903, St. Albans bought land for a chapel next to what was then the brand new Jesse Reno School for African American students. So we have a photo of St. George's congregation taken probably about 1905. I'm sorry, the quality is not great, but you can see the congregation all dressed up for church, possibly anticipating they were going to be in a photograph. Off to the right, you can see two individuals, and those are, I believe, Reverend Bratnall of St. Albans and his wife, Louisa, standing there to the right. And off to the left is, I believe, Charles Warner, who became the vicar of St. Columba's. St. George's got a big boost in 1906 when Reverend Douse became the vicar. Douse was an interesting man. He was a Black Jamaican priest born in the British West Indies. He came here and he studied for a while under Bishop Satterley. He held a dual position at St. John's Chapel for African Americans in Georgetown. He was a regular member of St. Albans clergy. And he stayed in both the St. John's and St. George's positions for a long time, until 1929 to 1930, when both chapels closed. And he was very successful in growing St. George's. He earned a lot of praise from the diocese for doing that. Here we have a photograph of St. George's congregation around 1908. And we can see once again, the congregation is dressed in their Sunday best, again, maybe expecting to be in a photograph. And we can see Reverend Douse up toward the right in this photograph. He's the man wearing a hat. The other people off to the left in this photograph are, I believe, some of the lay leaders of the parish. So by 1913, the chapel for St. George's was finally completed. And it actually earned a lot of press coverage. The press coverage here we can see in the Evening Star praised Douse for his work in building the congregation. And the bishop consecrated the chapel in August of 1913. In this photo, we see St. George's Chapel around 1917. And you can see another building just off to the right in this photograph. That would be the Jesse Reno School for African American students. And this was a good location for St. George's because it was offering some night school classes for adults. St. George's was even offering some daycare for working mothers. So now you have these three churches. What was the relationship between them like? There was actually quite a lot of good collaboration between them. The clergy participated in each other's services. Reverend Douse attended diocesan conventions along with the other clergy. This was at a time when African Americans did not always attend diocesan activities. St. George's used St. Columba's Parish Hall for some events. But the congregations remained really very separate. Segregation was pervasive, including in the Episcopal Church. Social events were held separately for St. George's, and St. George's had fewer resources. It didn't have a parish hall or a regular deacon. St. Columba's was raising money during this period by putting on shows in its parish hall for the neighborhood. These included minstrels, where the white performers were wearing blackface, something that I hope St. Columba's wouldn't be doing today. So by the early 1920s, we can see that the paths of St. Columba's and St. George's actually merged, and yet they start to diverge. St. Columba's became a separate parish in 1924, Reverend Shearer had increased membership and had strengthened the finances. The Marianne Murdoch bequest really laid the foundation for fiscal independence. St. Columba's used the money to buy the rest of the land where our chapel stands today and to also start building the stone chapel where we are now worshiping. New parish boundaries were drawn, and St. George's actually fell within the boundaries drawn for St. Columba's Parish. And so St. George's became a mission of St. Columba's. Well, St. George's continued to be very active, but Reverend Douse was really very ill. And I suspect that what happened was he was suffering from the effects of the flu virus from the pandemic of 1918 to 1919. Reverend Shearer got it, and the records show that he felt the after effects for some time. In 1920, the bishop urged Douse to take his first vacation in many years. Douse returned from a few months of vacation in Jamaica, and he asked the diocese for more resources. He said St. George's needed its own parish hall and a deacon to grow, but it doesn't appear that he received these. And then at the diocese, for the first time, despite earlier support for St. George's, some members of diocesan committees started to question the location of St. George's in Tenleytown. It's unclear exactly why they thought that that was not the best location, but the records indicate they were concerned about that. During this period, of course, real estate developers and city officials were pressing to clear the Reno community. There was a false claim that the community was blighted, which was really thinly disguised racism. They wanted the land to build a junior high for white students, and they wanted to build an all-white neighborhood nearby, which was, of course, eventually achieved through the use of restrictions on land use, such as racially restrictive covenants that prohibited people of color from buying homes in the area. Well, what was the relationship like after St. George's became part of St. Columba's Parish? St. Columba's started publishing its own weekly newsletter called The Messenger. And we can see here that the cover identified St. George's. Reverend Douse was the vicar, along with William Shearer as the rector of St. Columba's. But there were no real news articles in the newsletter about St. George's. This was in contrast to St. Albans newsletters, which had always had stories about St. George's. We do know that Reverend Douse became a member of the men's group at St. Columba's. He actually made some presentations to the group, but there's very little information about St. George's in St. Columba's records. Unfortunately, the vestry minutes for St. Columba's for this period have been missing. We haven't been able to locate them. The records that we do have for this period show that St. Columba's was deeply engaged in raising funds for the new stone chapel. In fact, the only reference I could find to Reverend Douse in the Messenger was that he said the blessing for the dinner of the men's group that was held to prepare for St. Columba's pledge campaign in 1925. Well, St. Columba's achieved its goal of building its current chapel. It was consecrated in 1927, and there were several news accounts of the laying of the cornerstone. Here we see a photo that appeared in the newspapers. The articles identified all the many dignitaries who officiated: the bishop, the rectors of St. Columba's and St. Albans, the various vestry members. The stories did not identify the two African American men who were actually doing the work of placing the stone. We see these two men in the close-up photo on the right. The stories also didn't mention Reverend Douse, who I believe I've been able to get a glimpse of by him standing behind some of the men in the foreground. During this same period, the United States Senate was holding hearings on whether to appropriate funds to build an all-white junior high on the Reno land. Well, most of the testimony at the hearings was in favor of the junior high there. The Reno residents themselves were not even told about the hearing, but a lawyer named James Neal read about it in the newspapers and brought people with him to testify. No one from St. Columba's, St. George's, or the Episcopal Diocese attended the hearing. A few senators expressed concern about the destruction of the Reno community. Here's some of what they heard. Thornton Lewis, who was the vice president of the Reno Citizens Association, testified that they are working men and that they couldn't buy a chicken coop with the little money they would get. James Warren testified that he wouldn't sell his home. He said it took him his whole life to get it and that he had just bought a new home there last year. Thomas Walker said, "You love your home." He recalled how Black residents had built little huts there 70 years ago to get out of the way of people who wanted to be rid of them, and then walk down to the heart of the city for work. He said, now those people have followed them out to Reno and want to drive them out with no place to go. Lucinda Harper testified that her husband was crippled and that there would not be enough money to buy any place else. She said, where will I go? If you take my home and all the improvements that I have made there on Davenport Street and turn me out of doors, would it be fair in the sight of God? S.W. Hebron testified on behalf of the Methodist Episcopal Church at Reno, a different church. He said it was a large congregation planning to expand. He said he was getting on in years and didn't want to sell his home that he had built, and that he couldn't buy another house in other parts of the city where it was desirable to live. And finally, Dr. Edward Jones testified that he was a former resident who had become a physician, was now going to people's homes to treat them. And he said the homes are well kept, they're orderly and neat, and that there was not a blight at Reno. Well, the 1926 appropriation bill died, but it was reintroduced in 1929. And so there was more Senate testimony at hearings held in January of 1929. Again, most of the testimony broadly was in favor of the junior high, and now additionally some parks at Reno. Neville Thomas of the NAACP's chapter in DC testified on behalf of the Reno residents. He implored the senators to defend the interests of the Negro population of Reno and to prevent DC commissioners from driving people from their homes. Some senators and one commissioner remained concerned about the Reno residents, so a compromise decision was reached to first acquire the land for the junior high and then more land in stages. But the fate of the Reno community was really sealed by this time, and there was slow decline as the residents began to leave. No one at St. Columba, St. George's, or the Episcopal Diocese of Washington testified at the 1929 hearings. But Reverend Douse must have been following these hearings very closely, because 3 days later, he met with the diocese's Office of Missions, and he told them that St. George's must be sold soon. In fact, St. George's was located really pretty much right on the land that would be taken for the junior high. The following day, Reverend Curran at the Episcopal Diocese's Office of Missions wrote to Reverend Shearer at St. Columba's, and he said, I feel that the Department of Missions, in cooperation with the Vestry of St. Columba's, should have an understanding as to the future of St. George's Church. He suggested a plan to relocate St. George's, and he expressed concern about Reverend Douse. He said he really is a sick man and needs every care and help. 2 months later, St. Columba's Register replied to Reverend Curran, saying that the vestry was very grateful for the concern about St. George's, that it had adopted Reverend Curran's recommendations in spirit, and that it would take action to set aside a fund to perpetuate the work of St. George's Chapel. So the destruction of the Reno community began during 1929. We can see here on the left some of the houses that were once there. And in the photo on the right, there were demolition crews that had already begun. So what did St. Columba's do in response to all of this? Unfortunately, we just don't know much about that. The vestry minutes, as I mentioned, are missing. And so we don't have any record of official decisions or actions taken by St. Columba's. It's possible individual parishioners tried to do something, but we don't have a record of that. Even the issues of St. Columba's newsletter, The Messenger, are missing during this period. But what we do have is the June 30th, 1929 edition, which shows once again St. George's on the left, but then by October 6th of 1929, St. George's is no longer mentioned as a mission of St. Columba's. We only see William Shearer as the rector. So what was going on during this period of St. George's having to relocate? Well, during this period, we don't really know what was happening, but by November of 1929, the Episcopal Diocese of Washington wrote to Reverend Shearer about organizing a new church near Howard University. He asked what had become of the organ at St. George's Chapel, and that they would be very glad for any church furnishings St. Columba's might have. He also said that he understood that the rector and the vestry had set aside funds to keep St. George's in existence because there was a legacy that had been left to St. George's. And he thought that using the name of St. George's for the new church would strengthen St. Columba's claim on a legacy when it fell due. And so he asked Shearer what he thought of calling the new church St. George's. But we don't have any further records of St. Columba's response to relocating St. George's. All of the records that I've been able to find came from the Episcopal Diocese of Washington, not from St. Columba's. And there are no records of St. Columba's setting aside funds or providing furnishings, and we don't have any records regarding any legacy having been received for St. George's. In fact, some additional research I've done indicates that no legacy was ever received. So what became of St. George's? Well, some of the parishioners from St. George's followed Reverend Douse down to St. John's in Georgetown, but that chapel also closed pretty much for the same reasons in 1930. But St. George's has survived. It's now located at 160 U Street Northwest, and we see a photo of their current building today. In fact, I have also heard that our own former assistant rector, Rose Duncan, grew up in this church. And this is the site where it's the former site actually of St. George's at Reno. You can see off to the right, the Jesse Reno School for African American students. That was renovated, and actually Alice Steele Elementary School was added onto and connected to the former Jesse Reno School, and it's used today as part of Alice Steele. Where this curved driveway and the fire hydrant are is where St. George's once existed. But there's no sign that St. George's was ever located there. If you take a moment to look at the handout that we've provided, and we won't spend time on this right now, but look at it yourselves later. And what you can see is that what happened at St. George's, at the Reno community in St. Columba's, was just really a microcosm of what was happening throughout Washington, D.C. and throughout the United States during this period. Well, I started with some questions that had occurred to me, and I'll leave you with some more that have also occurred to me. Obviously, we're still trying to understand what did St. Columbus do to help St. George's and the Reno residents. We have no evidence that St. Columbus tried to prevent the destruction of the Reno community. And it's unclear what steps St. Columbus took to help St. George's relocate. It would certainly be great to be able to find our missing vestry minutes. Another question that has occurred to me is, well, what should St. Columbus have done to help the Reno residents? Should we have done more? Should we have testified at the hearings? Should we have held a protest rally? And how would St. Columbus respond to something like this today? And finally, the big question for me is, how did these events of 100 years ago shape St. Columbus Parish? And are the effects of these events still felt today? And so I will leave you there.
Thank you, Sandra. Thank you for that comprehensive presentation. And I now open it up for questions. Questions from the nave, please hand them to Joshua and other volunteers in the audience. And those of you online with us, please type them into the chat and I will gather them.
One question to start off. Yes, great question. Hold on, I'm going to get a mic for everyone else, but while you're here, did you ever find evidence of St. Columba's members involved in the Ku Klux Klan?
That's a great question, Joshua. And no, I have not found any evidence of that. You know, it's possible. I think it's entirely possible that there were parishioners at St. Columba's who supported the building of the Alice Steele Junior High School. The area needed a junior high. The white population was growing fast during this period. Again, we don't have any further detailed information about what St. Columba's parishioners individually were doing during this period.
Other questions, Joshua?
Hey, all, thanks for sticking with us as we navigate this technological chasm. Another question is, did St. George's have a cemetery in the Fort Reno area where bodies moved in and possibly to the Moses Cemetery on River Road?
Well, that's also a very good question. There was a cemetery. It wasn't dedicated simply to St. George's, but it was located up sort of to the northeast of the Reno community, sort of up around where Chevy Chase Parkway and Reno Road are today. I believe that that cemetery was slowly being dismantled and closed as the new homes were being built by the whites who were moving to the area. And many of the graves were then reinterred out at the Moses Cemetery along Reno Road. Whether or not any of the graves of St. George's parishioners were among those who were then moved to the Moses Cemetery along River Road or not, I simply don't have any records of that. It's certainly possible.
Another question from the chat. Who were the St. Columba's parishioners at this time? Where did they live and what were their livelihoods?
Well, there's sort of a long arc here of time. In 1874, I think, these parishioners who were coming to the little wooden chapel were really just, these early working class people who had settled in after the Civil War. It's possible that some African Americans came during this very early period. We don't have a record of who they were. As time progressed, it seems quite clear that the congregation became virtually entirely white. There were some recollections that have been recorded of a man named William Page, who was a longtime member of St. Columba's, actually a senior warden of the vestry, and he was interviewed in the 1970s. And he recalled that there was one African-American woman who came to St. Columba's probably around 1915 or so, and that everyone loved her, but that she was the only African-American woman who was coming to the church at the time. And so I think as time went on and the area became more white and more prosperous, the parish was just becoming a more prosperous and professional or commercial class of white people.
Back to you, Joshua.
Yeah, another question here. Is it possible to trace families of the Reno community or St. George's families who were forced to move?
That's also a wonderful question. A lot of work is being done on that, and I wasn't able to include that in the presentation. The Park Service has hired a historian, and he has, and I've been in contact with him, as well as another cultural anthropologist, and we have been kind of collaborating to reconstruct what's happened with all of these people. The historian for the Park Service will actually be publishing some very interesting results of his research. But we have been able to follow some members of the Brooks family who were held as enslaved persons by founders of St. Albans and St. Columba's to the Reno community, and then beyond that. And so whether they were worshiping at St. George's or not, I can't say, because we don't have clear records of that. The Brooks were baptized at St. Albans, but then as they moved out to Reno, may well have attended St. George's.
I'm going to read one last question from the chat, and then that's all we have time for. And I think this is more of a discussion question, which we won't have time for. But another important, from Jeff Moore, another important discussion question, I think, is how should St. Columba's compensate the descendants of those whose land and enslaved labor form the basis of our wealth today?
Well, one thing that we can look at is the Compensated Emancipation Act of 1862. There, Congress passed a separate law. This was before the Emancipation Proclamation at Lincoln's time. A separate law was passed in 1862 that actually freed enslaved persons in the District of Columbia and provided compensation for those who had held those enslaved persons. And we can kind of look to that, I think, as perhaps some guide in thinking about how to compensate people who were not compensated in 1862 and whose descendants have not received the benefits.
Well, thank you, Joshua, Sandra, Linda, Patty, Bill, Elizabeth, Baden, all of those who helped make this presentation possible today. Again, many thanks to you, Sandra, for your exhaustive and continued work on this subject. We've all learned so much. And thank you for taking action to learn about our history. This has been recorded. It will be available on YouTube. Thank you for coming. Look for a short survey for those who registered to get your reactions. And if you have other questions about this forum, future topics that Stirring the Waters could cover in these sessions on our history, we look forward to hearing them. And again, visit the websites, Stirring the Waters and our Facebook page, which I will post here,